Well, hi, everyone. Welcome to the Tapestry Podcast. I'm your guest host, Hanna Oh. I have been a Tapestry member since the start of the church, and I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist and have been for the past 15 years. I'm also a tenured faculty at a local Cal State University, and I've had the pleasure of being invited into various spaces to provide a mental health perspective for Tapestry. Some of you may know me as wife of Alex O, mother of Lucy and Luke O, and the Tapestry women's football coach. So this season, we're diving into a new sermon series called Whole and Reconciled. So on today's episode, we will be exploring wholeness and reconciliation through the concept of God and how early caregiver relationships can help explain the emotional bonds or attachments between people. All right, so today, as the guest host, I will have the privilege of interviewing some important people that we have. So first we have Stacy Aguilar, who's our family and marriage director. And then we also have Pastor Aaron, who's the cell and youth pastor.
Hi.
Hi. Thanks,
All
Hannah.
right. Well, I'm new to this. I know you two are veterans. Pastor Aaron, I heard you just recently turned 30. How do you feel about that?
Honestly, there was a lot of reflection. Just a new decade. And one thing that I think resonated with me was Jesus, he started his ministry in 30. And I feel like it kind of felt like in some ways like a new chapter also in my ministry as well, with some transitions taking place. But aside from that, just my personal life too, just thinking about various different things like family planning maybe on the horizon and other things. So yeah, I'm excited for the next decade.
All right. That sounds like a really mature way to enter into the 30s. I don't know if I did that. Stacy, do you have any thoughts on, now that you've been in your 30s for a while, any advice on how to get through the 30s?
Well, actually, when we were leaving dinner with Aaron and his, we had a little birthday party for him. Pastor James and Elisa were making fun of Diego and me and saying, you guys are the oldest ones there. I can't believe Aaron even invited you because we're 37. So we are now just graduating from our mid-30s into our upper 30s. I'm actually really nervous about that. Hannah and I actually have the same birthday.
Yes.
February 7th. Woot woot. I would say I think 30s has been one of my favorite phases of life, but caveat that with I think it was the hardest phase of my life. I think 30s was unexpected hardships that I just thought would happen later in my life, and it happened in my 30s. So brace yourself. It's going to be really fun. But I think about people now, dirty 30, flirty 30. I'm like, no, man. 30s are when you hit the hardships of adulthood. That's how I view 30s now.
Oh, I see. Well, you are not the oldest today. I am the oldest. But, I'm now going into my 41st year.
Yes.
And so
Nice.
40 was not the best. But I think this new year, now that I'm in it, I'm comfortable, right? So hopefully it'll be a year of growth as well. So, we're now in the second week of our new series. What are both of your thoughts on the new series so far?
I think for me, it does kind of bring me back a little bit to our EHS series we had, 6 years ago now? And actually, funny enough, I wasn't a Tapestry member at that time. I was just kind of in a season of exploring new churches to go to. But that was probably one of the significant reasons why I felt called to be a part of Tapestry and attend Tapestry. And I think the fact that, especially a predominantly Asian American church, was talking about and engaging with the idea of discipleship from a holistic level and understanding and integrating the importance of emotional health into that conversation was just a total different paradigm than what I was presented with growing up in church. And I think it offered me I guess just language for what I felt like I longed for in my own discipleship journey to Jesus. Yeah, I mean, as we're starting this new series, I'm just so excited. For myself personally, I'm excited for our church to just go deeper in wholeness.
Pastor Aaron, I learned that you did your MDiv with a concentration in pastoral care and counseling. Can you share a little bit about what made you interested in pursuing counseling in the first place and also maybe what you think about it now that you've been in ministry for a while.
Yeah. So I grew up in a home where I have a mom who has schizophrenia. I have two older sisters that have developed their own diagnosis of mental illness. So that's like a really personal part of my story. And so I felt like the area of mental and emotional health was something that I wanted to engage in just my ministry. I will say now, having been done with seminary for a few years, and having practiced like pastoral care and counseling type settings, I realized, oh, you got to be really called to do this line of work. And not to say that it's not going to be a part of like obviously the pastoral ministry work that I do, but I think it's just that it's just a part of it. Yeah, I will say, maybe this is just like a last thought. Yeah, I will say that what I've gained from my training was so invaluable just for me personally in my formation as a person, my formation and as a pastor, as a child of God, as a husband, as a son, as a friend. Like I felt like that was just so invaluable because, yeah, a lot of the things that I learned was a journey to dive into the interior life and deal with things that are there beneath the surface.
Well, Stacy, I feel like so many within our church know you because they have to kind of go through this course with you, a lot of them, the premarital course. You've kind of been taking the lead on that for so long now. What's kind of been your thought process about having provided that class for so long? Is there anything you feel like you've been learning about yourself through that process or just in general, having counseled people for so long?
Yeah, of course, premarital is different than actually like marital counseling. And sometimes there are people who are married who come to premarital in their first year of marriage, just seeking more care and counsel. And I think in the beginning, when I first started teaching premarital and people were either married and having issues, I always felt that there are ways that you can come out if it's a detriment to you in some way. But I'm realizing now, having done premarital and walking with people who have been in long relationships, that God is completely capable of redeeming anybody's marriage. I always thought like, okay, if there's infidelity, then there's no coming back from it. Or even if there's abuse, emotional abuse, even physical abuse, like there's no coming back from it. Get out. That was kind of my always, before I taught, or even my first year of premarital, the way that I had thought about marriage and the way that I had thought about relationships. But the more and more I'm learning about God's love, looking into scripture for pictures of how he loves us, I'm realizing that when both people are willing to come before God and confess their sin and want to make changes and really work and allow, like Pastor Charles shared 2 Sundays ago, I guess, the idea of like indwelling, like if they're willing to make their marriage a place of dwelling place, that God's arm is not too short. He is capable of redeeming your marriage no matter what. And then the other thing I want to share is this is a quote that I share in the beginning of our first class, but it's from John Piper, This Momentary Marriage. And this was actually on our marriage bulletin program, but it says marriage is about portraying something true about Jesus Christ and the way he relates to his people. It is about showing in real life the glory of the gospel. The beauty of the covenant-keeping love between Christ and his church shines brightest when nothing but Christ can sustain it. Most foundationally, marriage is the doing of God, and ultimately, marriage is the display of God. And so I think for us, it's at Tapestry, is understanding what is the purpose of marriage. And if marriage is the display of God, then there is nothing that God cannot heal.
So today we're going to talk a little bit about attachment and how it impacts our relationship with others and also kind of our relationship with God. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time kind of briefly talking about attachment theory and providing some examples. Would that be okay?
Yeah.
All right. You gotta earn my keep, right? You're like, why am I the guest host?
This is
like,
why
who's
you're
this
here,
girl?
Hannah.
I want to preface this by saying there's lots of theories in psychology. This just happens to be one of them. And as those who are listening, you may find yourself thinking, oh, that's me or that's me. And I think we want to provide this information so you have a place to kind of understand what's happening for you, but don't feel a need to kind of fit yourself concretely into one box or label yourself. Use this as a tool to continue to work on the process of healing. So classic attachment models were originally formulated and researched by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. And basically the idea is that human beings have an intrinsic human need to bond or connect. And it's very adaptive for us. So again, it would be adaptive for a baby to bond with the mother and vice versa, right? So this is kind of where it stems from. And so a lot of attachment theory focuses on the relationship between early caregivers and the child and how these early experiences then shape how we interact with others in adulthood. So this makes sense, right? Because the first early relationships that we have start to create a model for us in terms of how we understand people in general, right? So if the first people who are supposed to love and take care of us do it well and consistently, then we would expect that to happen in adulthood. And then as we get treated a certain type of way, then we also then have an internalized idea of who we are, what are we worth, because this is how we're being treated. And sometimes if that is done in a inappropriate way or inconsistent way, then again, that can have, a repercussion as well. So that can determine an insecure attachment. Children who have a consistent, helpful, or loving caregiver can come to this idea that, my needs will be met. And that even if there's disappointments, I am resilient enough to bounce back. So again, this is that picture of a kid who knows that their mother is around, so can go and explore the world and know that when they come back or if they need something, the mom is there. Does that make sense so far? Okay. So in this theory, they also talk about 3 subsets of insecure attachment. So the first is this idea of an anxious, preoccupied attachment or ambivalent attachment. In this attachment style, your caregiver or the person in your life didn't really respond to your needs in a consistent way. So you get to this idea that you can't really count on others to meet your needs. So, this idea of someone who may be too clingy or they're really needing consistent affirmation or validation or reassurance. I can't really fully rely on this person, so I need them to tell me repeatedly that they care for me, they love me. And you might crave closeness and intimacy, but you kind of have this feeling of, I can't really fully trust in it. The second attachment style is called avoidant dismissive. And this is, stemming from, again, maybe inconsistencies or lack of availability, but instead of becoming overly anxious, they become more detached. So children who maybe kind of learn, I can't rely on other people, I'm going to rely on myself. So rather than getting my hopes up, getting disappointed, I'm going to be independent, more rigid, closed off. And then lastly is the disorganized, disoriented attachment style. And again, this may come from inconsistent relationships, but also, trauma, abuse, neglect. And this is that idea that in this attachment style, you feel unworthy of love or you are terrified of getting hurt again. So, a lot of times children, when they experience abuse or trauma, even in that young state, it's hard to blame the parent. So you're not saying, oh, I'm being treated this way because my mom is bad or my dad has problems. They actually then internalize it and say, maybe it's because I'm bad that they're treating me this way. So in some ways, this is their way of trying to understand the world. But over time, it becomes this disorganized, disoriented type of attachment. So even though they're in relationships, they may continue to question, like, am I worthy? Am I going to get hurt again? I know I went through that really quickly. I hope that was somewhat helpful. Basically, the idea is that these patterns, though developed when you're younger, sometimes get confirmed or maintained in current relationships. So in a cyclical way, when we go into new relationships, even in adulthood, with our own expectations, sometimes our reality is shaped by our expectation. If I expect that this person is going to hurt me, I may then perceive that they are continuing to hurt me or disappoint me. Or sometimes our expectations, again, shape our perceptions. It may not be occurring in that way, but that's all that we see. Okay, so I nerded out a little bit for a minute. Was there anything that didn't make sense or you wanted any clarification before we move forward?
No, that was really helpful.
Yeah, that was really good. I do have a question. I wonder if, is this all the way through your teen years? Because, your brain is not fully formed until you're 25.
Yeah.
I always make fun of Aaron because he got married before you were 25, right? I'm like, your
Yeah.
brain wasn't even fully developed, bro.
I know. I have thoughts about
Yeah,
that.
no offense.
Yeah.
No offense, Pastor
was
Aaron and
built
Jen.
diff.
Yeah, totally joking. But also, like, if you take my premarital class, please. But thinking literally, like, the way that I parent my children now, like, how long do I have until I can help formulate and change their attachment styles?
I think it's, there are some people who say like 0 to 5 is like one of the most
Yeah.
important, times of your life. But I think I don't want folks to feel pressured like, oh my gosh, if I make a mistake now, it's like done for the rest of your life. Some people can have very secure relationships and have experiences when they're in young adulthood that can impact them. I mean, I think the idea is that because when we're younger, we don't have a lot of power. We don't have a lot of say. So we are susceptible to other people's choices and whether they're positive or negative. And so in theory, the idea is that the young attachment is very important, but that it doesn't mean to say that there isn't room for resiliency or remedy. It's not this idea that like once it's done for life. There's always room for growth. There's always room to change. So I know I indirectly answered that question.
Yeah, the good enough parent, right?
The good enough parent, they say it's like 50%, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to meet someone's needs 100% of the time. That's not what is expected.
That's
Yes.
literally my mantra when I know I fail as a parent. I'm like, I just have to be good enough.
Yeah, just good enough. Was I warm?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, having said that, Stacy and Pastor Aaron, what are your thoughts about, thinking back to your early relationships and how you think it may have affected your relationship styles with people, now?
I think about actually more than my own personal attachment with my my parents, who I think they're both very, very warm, and although I do think my style is a little bit more anxious. I'm just anxious by nature. I'm a 6'7". We're very fearful people, but probably having to deal with maybe the way that I was given care. But I think about how I parent Olive and Milo and how if I am not emotionally healthy, it will directly reflect the way that my children view themselves, view me, and view God. I know I'm not a perfect mother, but I do notice that when my mom is anxious, I immediately start to feel anxious, and I try to solve her problems for her. And I've noticed that when I'm anxious, my daughter gets really anxious, and I find myself immediately wanting, it's like our children are like a mirror, right? They're like a reflection. And so I notice that in ways that I am not emotionally healthy, that it's important that I rightly reflect God's love so that my children can rightly view God. And we make it clear that we fail as parents. One of the things that we tell our kids every day is, Mommy loves you, Daddy loves you. If I'm talking to Milo, I'll say, Nuna loves you, but God loves you the most. I really want them to know that because we are going to fail as parents, and we are not perfect reflections of God's love for you. But it does kind of put I don't know about a burden, but like maybe like a fire under our butts. Like it's really important that we take care of ourselves as parents to be emotionally healthy and to seek the Lord right, because this will directly affect the way that they view God and the way that they will view their future partners.
Yeah, I think, you're kind of reminding me of something that I think Alex and I have intentionally done. Alex is my husband. Have been really mindful of doing with our own kids is like apologizing to them. And I think of that, I mean, in the lens of attachment, like you don't have to have perfect attachment, but you have to be able to know that it's not always your fault, right? So when you don't apologize, there's kind of this idea that like you brought it on, if a parent is angry with you, like you as a child brought it on, or like I did something bad and it's always me doing something bad. But I think the idea of like even parents are imperfect, but being imperfect doesn't deter you from intimacy, right? Like just because mom is imperfect doesn't mean that mom and child can't be close. But I think that's one of the things we've been really thoughtful of doing is like if I have a moment where I lash out or I was feeling really irritable and impatient and I like yell at them, I always am thoughtful to be like, I'm really sorry. I had this moment. I'm being really tired and, that wasn't right. And I'm hoping that kind of, again, creates this idea that like you can be authentic and it's very acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
Pastor Aaron, what about for you? As you're thinking about like your early relationships, what are your thoughts on how you think that's shaped you?
Yeah, I've done a lot of reflection. I've done different seasons of counseling, kind of just processing, I think, my experience growing up. And as I mentioned earlier, growing up with a mom who developed schizophrenia basically when I was an infant, that kind of set the baseline, I think, for our home environment. And I think in a lot of ways, because I have two older sisters. I now have also a younger brother who's a lot younger than me, but two older sisters who are twins. And I think because they were a little older, maybe more tangibly internalized, like the trauma of seeing like our mom, become mentally and emotionally unstable, and not being emotionally or mentally present as a parent anymore from that point on. And they were like toddlers while I was like probably a newborn. And so I think that kind of set the trajectory for like a lot of my home environment where mom isn't stable, dad is trying to like pick up the pieces, and he was like a young business owner, so he's trying to like, make it in his career, while having a wife, which now I understand like how difficult that must have been, having young children, trying to manage, just surviving. And so all to say, I think that led to a lot of like my experience of parenting growing up was lack of involvement, lack of presence, and lack of a sense of healthy control, like of like our home life. It was very disordered in our home, because dad was often busy with work. Mom was emotionally and mentally incapable of being present and available. And so that kind of developed into like a lot of abusive and chaotic relationship dynamics with siblings. But yeah, I think that's just kind of some of the background for like my experiences growing up. And definitely I will say, to connect that back to like relationships today, or how I've experienced relationships in adulthood, in my marriage, in friendships, I have definitely noticed, like, maybe to refer back to like attachment theory, like some avoidant type tendencies if I have a bent towards one.
Yeah, sorry, Stacy.
No, I was just going to say, knowing Pastor Aaron, my husband and I are really close to you, and I think you are a testimony to me of like, yes, you had a very chaotic childhood, and probably your mom was incapable, not necessarily her fault, it's just the way that her mental capacity, but yeah, even though you might not have had the healthiest child attachment growing up, just to see like who you are now. And of course, I didn't know you during the moments of, I know you had your own. When I first heard that Pastor Aaron had a rebellious phase, I was like thrown up. I was like, no way. He's like, does not seem like he would have had a rebellious bone in his body. But is just like, I think, again, a picture of, and kind of alluding to what I said about premarital, that there's like nothing that God cannot redeem and restore. Like even with a chaotic childhood and a mother who was dealing with a very severe mental illness, and two older sisters who also had to deal with it, that you're not defined by your trauma, that you're not defined by your past, that's not the end story that God has for you, that he is really capable, like finishing that good work in you. And I think you literally are a walking testimony of that. And of course, you had to do your own hard work as well. But yeah, it kind of gives me hope for like, even if you have failed attachments in early childhood, that doesn't mean that you can't have a beautiful marriage and beautiful friendship.
Right.
And be an amazing father one day, if Jen is willing.
I think, when we see growth and, this type of healing, it is really encouraging, but I also know that there are believers who are maybe right in the middle of just even starting to realize, wow, I've been impacted. Sometimes that end journey can feel so far away, right? Like, how do I even get to that process? And so I think, the part of what we want to share about is that there is a process. It's okay also if you have done a lot of healing, but you kind of keep feeling like you're going back to the same places. I know a lot of believers feel like once I'm healed, it should be one and done. But I think just a reminder to folks that it's not a linear path, that even if we've been healed, sometimes we find ourselves in old wounds and old places, and that it doesn't mean that we've backtracked, but sometimes God is presenting something new, and it's a different and new opportunity to work on it again in a different way. So I think I just say that as an encouragement. Again, like, sometimes these attachments are so ingrained that even though we're much healthier, we still struggle with it. And so that's okay, right? Don't beat yourself up. There are always ways to keep going forward. And that's why we have prayer and community and just kind of this series as well. I wanted to shift a little bit and talk about how then these experiences shape our image of God. And so, kind of similarly to what I've shared before about the different attachment styles, we also recognize that they also shape our relationship with God. So those relationships can mirror our other relationships, our relationships to authority or caregivers. So if we have an anxious relationship, we may be a believer and we desperately desire closeness, but we may constantly struggle with feelings of anxiety, like we're always disappointing God, or, I have to do X, Y, and Z to maintain this relationship because if I don't, we're not going to be close, Or you may be a believer that is a little bit more of a shutdown relationship where you have the right theology and you do the right things, but you are struggling to share your emotions with God, the intimate, vulnerable spaces. Or you desperately want to believe that God, loves you, but you don't believe that he likes you, right? So you, in your head, feel like, oh yeah, I know I deserve love and I know God forgave me, but continually may be filled with unworthiness or shame. So again, the reason we talk about these attachment styles is not just for our relationships, but to kind of figure out, how does this then affect how we view God? Are there skewed perspectives that we need to confront and change? So, having said that, when thinking back, do you think there were times where you feel like your past relationships, or again, like the skewed perspective, has affected how you view God, our Father?
Yeah, I mean, my dad and I were, my dad was seriously the best dad. I'm not trying to, like live him up because he passed away. So I always saw God as like really warm and kind. I never saw him. I mean, my dad never yelled, if you know my husband at all and my brother at all. All three of them are just like the gentlest, kindest people. And I probably went after somebody like Diego because that's who my dad was. He never yelled at us. And my brother, too. I've never heard him raise a voice. But I will say, when my dad was taken away, when he passed away, my view of God changed, because my dad was always obviously like physically present. We even lived with him. When I went to college, I lived apart. Then I went to Honduras for 3 years. I lived apart. And as soon as I could come back home, I wanted to live with my parents. Like, we are that close. And then we chose to buy a house together. But when he died, suddenly, I found myself more angry at God for taking away my dad. And I realized that my dad was my God in so many ways. And this past year has been God slowly like reclaiming his identity as my father, and not unhealthily placing all of my expectations, my desire for an earthly father. Like, I really sensed God telling me, like, let me be your father. I will be your provider. Even my go-to for anything was like, before God first was my dad. I need money. I'm not going to ask God for help. I'm going to go to my dad. I need love. I need fit. My dad was a very cuddly person, human being. He was always holding our hands. Even as an adult, I was holding hands with my dad, hugging him, kissing him. He was like that with my children. When I needed that, I went to him for that. It was just like everything. He was my everything. And then when he was taken away, I really sensed God being like, give me that place in your heart. And then same thing with my mom. My dad was definitely my mom's God. And that was something that she shared this past year. For her was God taking the rightful place in our heart as like, I am who I say I am, and I will be your provider, and I will be your lover, and all that stuff. So I think it's been interesting because, yeah, I feel like now I'm having more of a right relationship with God as Father. And even I remember when my dad passed away, I called Pastor Charles panicking because I was like, when I go to heaven, he won't be my dad anymore. And that like freaked me out because there's no marriage in heaven. And I wanted to keep that relationship. I loved being his daughter. Like that was my identity. And perceiving like it will be better. You can't imagine it, but I promise you it will be better because it will be the way that it was meant to be. And so I think that was the beginning of me relinquishing control and letting God be my actual father as he is in heaven. So it's not really answering it, but kind of.
I have so many questions I want to ask, but I did hear you say a couple times taken away.
Yes.
How do you feel like you've reconciled that idea and then somehow get reoriented back to this more appropriate concept of God?
Yeah, it does truly feel like we have been robbed, which is why I think I do always find myself saying taken away as opposed to like he's passed away. I do feel like he's been robbed from us. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't fully reconciled that because I still feel like it because he was only 64. So I do still feel that way. So I'm not sure. I feel like I'm not there yet. I'm still in that middle place of like continuing to wrestle with that. Even like some worship songs. Last Sunday, we sang like, we called and you answered, or like I still sense like, but you didn't answer because we were praying for healing. So I definitely still am in the raw middle of like unable to sing those songs.
Right.
Yeah. So I haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah.
I'm on that return to the Father. I am on my return to the Father still with that.
I think, though, that's really helpful for those listening, Stacy, because I think even as you are on staff and, help so many of us, like knowing that it's okay to also be struggling in certain aspects of God, right? Certain identities of God. It doesn't mean that you distrust him completely, but that there's still questions that you appropriately are able to ask him.
Yes.
And that you're still waiting for an answer.
Yeah.
Pastor Aaron, what about for you? Like anything you want to add about kind of having this right concept of God and healing through that?
Yeah, it's so interesting how your concept of God, which is so important and it's so foundational, but it's hard to sometimes distinguish like the concept of God with it and how much of it is affected by like our experiences and that we project onto that concept. And so for me, I think for the longest time, and still in many ways currently, I've actually had the hardest time asking God for things. That was just a aspect of prayer and my relationship with him that just didn't feel as natural. And I've learned to connect it and to connect it with a lot of my experiences growing up. I've alluded to like the experiences of abuse growing up and not feeling seen or protected during those, seasons or chapters of my life going through abuse and specifically from my parents, like my parents not knowing or not seeing how I was being harmed. And so in many ways, I feel like it was almost like this experience that internalized within myself, like you're not worthy to be seen or you're not worthy to have a voice or you can't voice out your concerns. They're not legitimate or, these types of narratives that I think I've internalized. And that kind of played out in the way that I related with God. And so even to this day, I think I more naturally connect with him, like just being with him, like contemplative. I don't know, maybe it's like part of my personality too. Like I just kind of connect with God that way or connect with him through his word or, other kinds of ways. But yeah, and I think like even to this day, like Jen kind of jokes with me. Jen's my wife. She kind of jokes with me and my mother-in-law who's in this joke as well. But they joke like, are you adopted, Aaron? Like, why don't you ever ask your parents for anything? Because I've like from like college on, I've like kind of done my own part-time jobs. I've done like, I got married at a young age, which Stacy mentioned earlier. Like I was like on that grind, focused on like, these different goals that I have and just getting them done. And I think that's how I navigated through a lot of my young adulthood, just making it work and might makes right kind of like philosophy of life. And if you and to this day even like I think like asking my parents for something, asking my dad specifically for something, whether it's materially or even like emotional support, that's still something that's hard. I respect him a lot and we have actually a very good relationship. We've had our own journey of like reconciling and things like that, but yeah, still to this day. And that's like an example I feel like for me of how those two are so closely linked together. And even though conceptually I might know, God is my father, God is my provider, God is my shelter, and I like would even meditate on these truths, But sometimes in actual experience, these are still things that I'm like working through to align, and just continually being fathered and parented by our Heavenly Father.
Can I add a story to that? That's so funny that you say that, because on Saturday came for prayer. I was like praying in the morning, and Olive had asked for this like Polly Pocket toy, but I really hate those toys because not only are they tiny, but like they go through phases of these toys and they just end up as trash in my house after like a week. So I don't like giving it to them. I always try to make them earn it, right? Whether it's like sticker charts or something. But as it came to prayer Saturday morning, I really sensed God like, just freely give. Like, don't make your kids earn every gift that you have for them, or just because it's their birthday, or just because it's whatever. Like, just freely give, because you want, I don't want them ever to stop asking me for things.
Yeah.
James looked over and he was like, "Are you shopping right now? Because we were supposed to be praying." And I was like,
You're
buying.
unconvicted.
And I was like, I'm buying something for Olive, because, yeah, I really sense like the way that we parent our kids, I want her to know that like she can go not only to me to ask for anything at any moment in time, even if I may say no, but that she can go to God. Yeah. And then even for me, like, even though that God did not answer this prayer that I was fasting for and literally crying out to the Lord, doesn't mean that I can't continue to ask, because I've noticed that I've stopped asking for God after he didn't answer that prayer of mine.
Yeah.
I was always asking, because I always asked my dad for everything. And when he didn't answer that prayer, I've realized I've stopped praying for prayer requests for myself.
Yeah.
Or even when other people say, "Hey, my dad is sick, can you pray for him?" Or somebody's sick and needs healing.
Yeah.
I don't want to.
Yeah.
And
there might be fear there, or
yeah.
having to cope with the disappointment, and how do you reconcile that?
Yeah, I'm realizing, like, right now, in the midst of this pain, my concept of God is not at a great place. As
We're
you
all on
shared,
that journey.
it reminded me.
Yeah, I think there's nuances, right? We can be really comfortable with one idea of God, but really struggle with a different concept of God. Like, some people can be okay with God as provider, but maybe not as God like the healer, or God as father. You know, I think similarly for me, I also have a hard time seeing God like a comforter or father. I'm very independent, so I am very okay with like God as like justice, or like, you know, but I have a hard time praying for myself. I have a very okay time praying for other people. But I think it's something that God's been asking me to do in prayer is, like, if I can't say anything, at least try to visualize him like giving me a hug. And I think that's just been something I've been trying to be okay with. Like, if you're not ready to verbalize, then at least try to have a image of like closeness. Again, I think we're all on our journeys in terms of like how we're experiencing God. I think hopefully in this podcast, you've kind of started thinking through about your own relationships, your early relationships. Again, not in a way to just point blame or to just be filled with anger or frustration, but to see where are areas where we can grow. And then how does this then impact our relationship with God? You know, is this impacted? Are there barriers or things in the way of our relationship with God? Pastor Aaron, do you want to share a little bit about other ways that the listeners can get involved?
You know, we have our weekly spiritual practices, just practicing, you know, the things that we're learning in hopefully a meaningful kind of way. There's our cell practices, which we can do in the context of community, which, yeah, I can say a lot too as the cell pastor as well. But yeah, community is going to be a really vital part, I think, of this journey. Even though it's an interior journey that God is inviting us to, that has to happen in the context of community, we believe. And then
Prayer room.
yes, prayer room was the last one. And maybe that speaks to more of the individual aspect, just doing the work of just coming before God. It is work in one sense, but I think in some ways it's just responding to an invitation that God is making to us at all times. And I hope that, you know, for those of you listening, yeah, in your own ways, you can kind of hear God's invitation for you in this season and just engage with him in community.
All right. Well, thanks for having me, folks. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much, Hannah.
Bye, Hannah.
Bye.